Good morning, vinyl community, crime community. Here's a record here about President John F. Kennedy. I picked this record up the other day. What does it say? There's a radio station that recorded this record called YMCA Radio Station in New York, New York. That radio station produced that and recorded that record I just showed you. And also, they were the first radio station in America to play the Beatles on the radio station. So that's your Beatles connection to the John F. Kennedy record. Now I'm here to the real purpose of reading out the Manson file. I'm at a chapter called 1230s Beloved American Fairy Tales of the 20th Century. Here we go. 12:30 p.m. Dallas time, Friday, November 22nd, 1963. There was a spot for the one brief shining moment known as Camelot. Until it passed that lone nut and crack Marxist marksman Marine fired a magic bullet from a high tower, slaying Camelot's charming king as the royal procession rode by the grassy knoll. While the subjects of the realm fell into mourning before this television sets, the lone nut was swiftly rubbed out himself by another lone nut for all to see. Thankfully, all the king's men quickly determined that the first lone nut was a fanatical traitor. He once dwelt in a faraway evil empire filled with foreigners practicing a strange creed called communism. The lone nut, the new king's expert communism of wise men decreed, not only ideological suspect, but an neurotic with delusions of grandeur. A nobody who longed to be somebody. That was all there was to the motiveless motives driving their ne'er-do-well, killing the charming king. There was no conspiracy, foreign or domestic. A wondrous report explaining these truths to the common folk was spread throughout the land. The second, this 100% non-conspiratorial assassination brought Camelot's imminent utopia to an end. A special conceptual time period called the 60s began with a bang. Unlike most chronological decades, the 60s started late on November 11, 1963, the day the king was killed. The same day, a fabulous foursome of troubadours from across the sea released their album, Meet the Beatles, just in time to bring hope to the gloomy populace grieving their fallen monarch. And so it was the Beatles invented the 60s, which lasted until exactly 12:30 a.m. Los Angeles time, Friday, August 9th, 1969. Then when four young black-clad assassins broke into the isolated home of total strangers they never met before, the Swifties slaughtered them all. The next morning, it was announced that a beautiful fairy princess, fear of her house guests, and a random teenage visitor had been slain or sacrificed in what was described by one town crier as a weird religious rite. For months, lurid rumors prevailed. Police and journalists wondered, did the fact that two slain were known drug dealers have anything to do with their deaths? Luckily, after the culprits were captured, the proper authorities refuted their scurrilous charge. A much more reasonable explanation emerged. The butchers of these random strangers didn't murder for the banal criminal reasons the police first suspected. Strange as it seemed, the killers were under the hypnotized spell of a wicked ogre. This dwarfish sorcerer's magic mind control powers could turn innocent maidens into bloodthirsty maniacs. If all there seemed too much like cheap fiction to be true, at least the official narrative of the midget monster's murder motive made perfect sense. He was an aspiring singer-songwriter, mad at a record producer and society in general, who didn't grant him a record contract. So instead of killing the record producer, he sent his satanic hit squad to kill random strangers now living in a house that the producer had moved out of 8 months earlier. Oh, he also believed ordering the zombie disciples to kill random strangers would kick off a race war prophesized in a Beatles album he was obsessed with. This would lead to him ruling that was all revealed in court by the prosecutorial genius. Civic order was restored. The hypnotic ogre was duly convicted of being evil incarnate. He was locked away forever in a dangerous drug dungeon for the crime of killing the 60s in the first degree. Now we're going to read a chapter called CHAR-LEE. Between the bloodstained bookends of those two somber 1230s lays in as yet unexplored path of hidden connections. Tracing the concrete route unearths unexpected entanglements, revealing the notorious nexus between organized crime and the entertainment industry for domestic intelligence agencies. Three-headed power driving American secret history in the 60s. Let's begin with two figures most commonly connected to these crimes. A parallel of intelligent but poorly educated men born within 5 years of each other in the 1930s, both sons of Southern families with Connecticut roots, latchkey kids raised without father figures, each struggling with troubled and impoverished single mothers, both united in misfortune by their extreme dyslexia that made reading and writing difficult. Along with learning disabilities, social alienating side effects, left to their own devices in loveless institutions, once abandoned to orphanages and boarding schools, while the others spent grim years locked up in an abusive reform school, both blamed for masterminding infamous crimes they did not commit. One, after declaring his innocence and identifying himself as a patsy, then denied his day in court when he's silenced by an assassin linked to organized crime. The government-sponsored report declared him guilty posthumously. The other, already declared guilty by the international press within days of arrest, was railroaded in a farcical show trial, people by lawyers linked to organized crime. In February of 1970, while petitioning Judge Malcolm Lucas for a change of venue in the Los Angeles court, the later of these accused fall guys compared himself to the deceased predecessor. You know, there has been more publicity on this, even more than a guy who killed the president of the United States. I think it's not like anything we have ever done in our country. This was Charles Manson referring to Lee Harvey Oswald. One of the most innocuous, or should we say least sinister, connections between the Warren reports posthumously railroading the Oswald and the later judicial disaster of the Manson Kangaroo Court was prominent California attorney Joseph Ball. A senior counsel as to the Warren Commission, Ball was charged by Earl Warren in 1964 with determining the identity of the Kennedy's assassin. It is a foregone conclusion that the obedient servant of the state would pin all guilt on Oswald. Ball was instrumental in pushing the less than believable magic bullet theory central to the Warren report. Among Ball's later clients were such rogues as John DeLorean, the disgraced automotive executive who tried to pull off a $24 million cocaine deal to salvage his failing car company, Nixon's henchman, John D. Ehrlichman of Watergate infamy, and Adam Khashoggi, the corrupt CIA-linked Saudi financier, armaments dealer, and Iran-Contra operative. Khashoggi, as mentioned previously, was later an associate of Gene Gutowski, whose inside knowledge concerning the murder of Polanski's wife and her friends Jay Sebring, Wojtek Wachowski, and Abigail Folger is significant. In December of '69, Judge William Keene asked the same Joseph Ball to apply his court experience to determine if Manson was capable of serving his own defense attorney when the already popularized, demonized defendant was asked for his constitutional right to represent himself. Your Honor, Manson said to Keene, this is no way I can give up my voice in this matter. If I can't speak, then the whole damn thing is done. If I can't speak in my own defense and converse freely in this courtroom, then it ties my hands behind my back and I have no voice, then there is no sense in a defense. Lawyers play with people, and I am a person I don't want to be played with in this manner. The news media has already executed and buried me. If anyone is hypnotized, the people are being hypnotized by the lies being told to them. There is no attorney in the world who can represent me as a person. I have to do it myself. Excuse me while I have to get a drink of water. Yeah, is Joseph Ball related to Lucille Ball? I have no idea. Joseph Ball thought more highly of Manson than he did of Oswald. Stated in the court on Christmas Eve of '69 that after their conversation, he assessed Manson to be able, intelligent young man, quiet-spoken, and mild-mannered. He went over different problems of law, and I found he had a ready understanding, remarkable understanding. As a matter of fact, he was a very fine brain. They complimented him on the fact, I think I told you, that he had a high IQ, must have been able to converse as he did. And he feels that if he goes to trial and he's able to permit jurors to the court to hear him and see him, he will realize he's not that kind of man who would perpetrate horrible crimes. Perhaps Ball would not have spoken so kindly of Manson if he'd known that the able, intelligent young man he had accessed was actually an early believer in a joint CIA mafia plot to kill JFK, exactly the conspiracy that Ball had worked too hard to dispute. The disreputable but well-connected source of Manson's knowledge on the collusion between organized crime and U.S. intelligence was a fellow criminal he was incarcerated with at the time of the Kennedy assassination in 1963, Alvin Creepy Karpis, a former leader of the infamous Depression-era Barker Gang. Is that like Barker Ranch? Karpis was the only one of the quartet of infamous crooks labeled Public Enemy Number One to be taken alive by the FBI. In fact, the new accounts of Karpis' dramatic arrest in 1936 compelled FBI J. Edgar Hoover to fame, and he was present at the scene. Hoover later became one of President Kennedy's most formidable enemies. Most researchers of the assassination believe Hoover to be a central facilitator in the Warren Commission cover-up. Whenever talk of the JFK assassination arose in our conversations over the years, Manson was adamant that the word he picked up in the underworld was similar to what Karpis had heard from mobsters he knew shortly after the Dallas ambush. Namely, that one reason Kennedy was rubbed out was because he broke his former bootlegger father's, Joseph Kennedy's, promise to the mafia to return their profitable criminal dope, gambling, and whoring oasis of Cuba to them if they managed to get his son into the White House. And what disgruntled elements of the CIA, for reasons of their own, were co-conspirators with the Cosa Nostra in this plot against a mutual enemy. When a king breaks a promise and goes back on his word, Manson said of JFK, he kills himself. Of course, no believers in the Warren Report will be dissuaded from his convictions by this ancient cell block gossip of two notorious convicted criminals, and just because some mobsters pleaded their particular account of their peers doesn't prove it's true. But at least interesting that Karpis expressed these views to Manson at a time in the early 60s when such now common theories about the JFK assassination were largely unknown. Due to Manson's own sympathy for all things Irish, he expressed a certain personal sympathy with Kennedy, seeing what happened to him as brutal business as usual in the favor-owing realm of the underworld. Still, he was no new frontiersman. In 1964, Manson supported Republican President Barry Goldwater for president. He later turned even more rightwards, expressed sympathy for George Lincoln Rockwell's American Nazi Party. eventually giving up and partisan politics altogether for less worldly pursuits. The courtroom encounter between Manson and Joseph Ball was not the only direct contact between the major members of the Warren Commission and the Manson commune. In September of 75, President Gerald Ford, ardent advocate of Oswald's sole guilt and the author of the deceptive 65 Oswald biography, Portrait of an Assassin, was walking past a crowd in Sacramento, California to meet California's Governor Jerry Brown. When he saw a young woman in a red approaching him later, Ford recalled, "As I stopped and saw a hand come through the crowd in the first row, and that was the first active gesture that I saw, but in the hand was a gun." The lady in red, pointing a Colt 45 at the president, most publicly and openly involved in the cover-up of his predecessor, John F. Kennedy's murder, was Lynette Squeaky Fromme, one of the few Manson forever communards to remain loyal after his conviction. Whether deliberately or accidentally, Fromme had not chambered the round, so her gun did not fire, and neither Ford nor any of the many bystanders were injured. Nevertheless, Fromme was convicted of trying to kill Ford, thus making a Manson associate the first person arrested for attempting to assassinate a U.S. president since Oswald. Fromme's action was not motivated by Ford's function as a compliant Warren Commission stooge. However, her historic encounter with Nixon's unelected successor, Ford, is part of a pattern of connections between individuals involved in the slaying of JFK in Dallas and its cover-up of the loose collective centered around Manson. Tex Watson and Sharon Tate were both born in Dallas, the city now synonymous with Kennedy's murder, Love Field. Could there be a more perfect 60s name? The airport in Dallas-Fort Worth, from whence JFK famously embarked on the fatal motorcade after the airport Charles Watson worked at when employed at Braniff International Airlines, baggage handler in the mid-60s. Love Field was also the locale from which Watson was flown under police custody after he was indicted for the Tate LaBianca murders, extradited from Texas after fleeing California in early October '69. While these synchronicities suggest a curious metaphysical affinity between the most infamous American crimes in the 1960s, we will limit our inquiry here to more pragmatic implications of only one question. Why were there three of the individuals involved in the aggressive cover-up of the true circumstances of the killings, of the Kennedy killing, also central to the cover-up of the so-called Tate LaBianca murders? I think we're going to end here. This continues with The Bug Goes from Death to Pigs to Talk of Bay of Pigs. It goes right into Hair Today, Gone Tomorrow, and Lawrence Schiller, who seems to be everywhere, doesn't he? Lawrence Schiller, yep. So we say thank you to the vinyl community and all the crime members, and we bless all the families and children.